Good evening and welcome to the continuation of Acton 250's countdown to the momentous events of April 19th, 1775. In a few moments, it will be my great pleasure to welcome Joel Bohy, a Historic Arms and
Militaria.
You're going to do military, all right. A military specialist to help us better understand the role of the militia in the Mass Bay and the accelerated arms race sparking the action taken by the Acton Minutemen, the shot heard round the world. But first, after a long winter's break, let's give a moment's consideration to Joel's audience this evening and to the need to regain our collective memory of the historical context we have previously established. Some in attendance have heard 7 sequential lectures and have been able to reconsider the history they learned decades ago through new sources and perspectives. At the other end of the age spectrum, we have a large contingent of AB students, primarily sophomores, I believe, who joined our countdown midstream. Their regular attendance and focused attention of so many students has been a source of considerable surprise to our speakers and great pride to our organizing committee. My spies tell me that you are currently focused on the complex Virginian Thomas Jefferson, so we need now to back up a bit. For you especially, and anyone else wishing to catch up or review, please visit our website, Acton 250 Events, where you will find links to previous speakers, upcoming events, and merchandise. Let's refresh what we have learned previously. Acton in the 1970s is on the periphery of a great seafaring empire. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is not front and center in the concerns of the British Crown. Acton is populated by yeoman farmers with small settlements clustered in the south around several mills, in the east along the Great Road, a small cluster to the north, and very little where we sit now in what we now know as Acton Center. As Mary Fuhrer explained to us, this society is hierarchical and patriarchal. Everyone has a set place, knows their role, or will likely be soon warned out. Many of the elders in the room tonight were taught that the first acts of rebellion focused almost exclusively on taxation. A series of taxes repeatedly repealed did cause tension, but much more was at stake as 1775 began. Robert Allison has twice helped our audience better grasp Boston's growing tension with the officers of the Crown. With the British East India Company nearing bankruptcy, London instituted a tea tax that might actually have reduced the price paid for this beloved import. Modern interpretations help us to grasp that the destruction of the tea on December 16, 1773, was both an effort to uphold the port laws, but not yield the colony's rights under the Charter of 1691. Massachusetts was not going to be governed by the British East India Company, and it was not going to reimburse the cost of the tea. Thus began the long year of 1774. Always remember the lag time between a local event and the known response of the Crown. Surely the King and Parliament would be offended, but no one anticipated the harshness of the official response arriving in May, the coercive acts. With the closure of the port and the abrogation of the Massachusetts Charter, the province saw its economy swoon and town-based self-government cease. Joseph Edelman described the role of newspapers for us in spreading the word into the hinterlands, such as Acton. Although the politics of Boston had seemed far away for much of the mid-century, suddenly the implications were shared. As we sit in a room once used for town meeting, the colonists lost the right to call the meetings upon which their agricultural livelihood depended. Bob Gross, best known for his path-breaking study of the Minutemen, concluded that the area's residents were essentially motivated by conservative intentions. They wished to conserve their New England way of life with its foundation of self-government. And so, how did they go about preparing to do so? We heard from John L. Bell, who shared his effort to trace the role of large munitions in preparing for an inevitable clash with the British regulars. Now it is time to turn to the arms carried by the militia and the Minutemen. The Acton 250 Committee learned of most of our speakers from a yearly weekend retreat for reenactors called The Hive. It was there in 2023 I first experienced the dedication and passion of Joel Bohy, his love for the weaponry used by both sides on April 19th. I was captivated, as you will be, by the detailed documents and thoughtful visuals he presented. With so many young people here tonight, hopefully he will share how his curiosity was ignited in his youth by being able to explore the area around the Concord Bridge. Just as newly available documents have expanded our understanding of the motivations of the participants in and witnesses of this era, he has masterfully employed archaeology and modern scientific strategies to fill out the story of these first engagements. We will conclude with several partners that have been working with us, explaining their relationship and a Q&A, and he will explain to us how we can obtain the book in the future. Can I hear a round of applause for Joel Bohy?
All right, can everybody hear me okay? All right, perfect. So a while back, I got very into the ballistics of muskets, how they function, and did a study on bullet strikes. And so in order to get to those bullet holes, we're going to have to go through a little bit of how this project started, as well as the arms that are being used and how they function. Because without knowing the ammunition that are fired, we couldn't be able to tell who fired what as far as all the extant objects that survive. So for me, I started as a little kid. As a 7-year-old, I grew up behind Merriam's Corner in Concord and was addicted to the history of April 19th. And it just fascinated me. So I spent a lot of time in the library trying to study, learning more about firearms and tracking down originals that still existed. And I was even a member of the Acton Minutemen, Isaac Davis Blues Fife and Drum Corps in the late 70s. I'm dating myself now. So the project began with archaeology. In 2012, Minuteman National Park was putting together a team to do the Parker's Revenge project, and I was on the advisory board. Come 2013, the project was about to start, and they told me that I couldn't be a part of it because I wasn't a professional archaeologist. So they had hired someone who I had seen on TV before and read his books, and it's Dr. Douglas Scott, who's in the black jacket on the right side. He had been the guy at Little Bighorn who had found all the bullet shell casings and had been able to track Native American and troopers across the battlefield based upon the firing pin impressions of the guns. It was really groundbreaking work that he used metal detection for. When a lot of archaeologists hated metal detectors, it was called the devil's stick because a lot of looters would use it to loot the battlefields. So archaeologists, and even to this day, don't really like metal detectors. But a metal detector is a tool. We use it to help learn more about the battlefields. And many of you already know, at Parker's Revenge, we found 32 musket balls, and we basically were able to lay out how that little action took place. So at Parker's Revenge, Doug Scott and I became good friends, and 2 years later, he said to me, you know, I'd love to learn more about the ballistics of these guns. How are we going to do it? And we needed guns to do it. And I happen to have 10 of them at home that were custom built that I used to live fire with and shoot and learn from. So We decided we were going to start with a live fire study south of Atlanta, Georgia. My wife and I loaded up the car with guns and metal detectors, and we drove all the way to Atlanta, and we spent a week shooting. And we hired a ballistician to come with high-speed cameras. We had Doppler radar, chronographs, checking the humidity and wind. We had all that stuff. We were able to produce 3 papers. Our first in 2017, which is online. Anybody can look at it for free. And that's my wife shooting on the cover. We did a second one in 2018. And a year ago, December, we did the last one, which was basically a validation study to shoot at original pieces of wood built into house sections to see what damage we would cause and see if what we're saying about the objects that survive are correct. So in order to understand all the bullet strikes, you have to understand how the guns function. And you probably heard the term, some of you, lock, stock, and barrel. This is the most important part right here, the lock. And you can see on the upper left inside of the pan, you would bite off a cartridge or use your powder horn to pour powder in there. You have a flint in the top jaw there, which will spark on the hammer and send a spark into the pan and light off that charge, which will set off the charge in the barrel. There's some internal parts that make it function also. You've got bridle, which holds the tumbler in place, sear spring, sear, and the main spring, which makes it all function. And here's the fun part. This is a lock photo, or lock video, high-speed video, of how it works. It's very slow motion, so you can see the whole thing. But the flint strikes off the hammer, sending sparks into the pan, which ignites the powder. And again, it's really slow, but it's cool. This is all the powder in the pan. And after that ignites, the charge will go off, and you'll see the big flame shoot out of the vent when the charge actually fires. Now this load, I double loaded it with 2 balls to do a test about the Boston Massacre. There are 2 musket balls that survive. And I never want to shoot a musket with 2 musket balls again. It just about took my shoulder off. And we did it 3 times. So another thing that a lot of people don't understand is today where you fire a 9mm gun with a rifled barrel, you fire a 9mm bullet. That wasn't the case in the 18th century. Black powder very quickly fouls the bore of the gun, and if you have a ball that's fitted to the bore of the gun, it's going to get jammed in the barrel and you can't load it. So they had something called windage, which is the ball is smaller than the bore of the gun. And so you could load multiple rounds without cleaning it. But there's a problem with that. I had these sketches done. You can see the charge in the top. It's rammed home, the powder. You can see paper balled up. But because there's a difference in the diameter of the barrel and the size of the ball, there's a gap. And that gap is what's called windage. On the bottom, you can see the charge going off, and you can see what happens. The gases push the ball forward, but they also go over the ball. And it allows the ball to scrape the barrel going out of the gun. And we'll talk about some of the charges or the ammunition we found like that in a minute. So keep your eye on the left of the screen. That's a muzzle of a provincial fowling piece. And you're going to see that blast, that initial blast come out. That's all from the windage. That's all the gases escaping prior to the ball being fired out. And then you'll see the flames start to come out, and there's the musket ball. And you'll see in a little bit, as things catch up with the smoke from the windage, you'll see some paper from the original blast, and you'll see the ball right behind it. And then the ball ends up passing the paper. You can see the little ball right in the middle of the paper. So that's what people call the evil effects of windage, because you lose a lot of gas pressure behind that ball, and it's not very accurate. So here's a ball. Does anybody remember this past July, there were newspaper articles and TV shows about 5 musket balls that were found at the North Bridge? Anybody remember that? All right. Well, I was on the team that found those musket balls. And this one is one of my favorites, because if you look at the ball, you can see a band around it. It's still round, but there's a band on it. And when this hit Facebook, some of the stupidest comments I've ever seen popped up. And one of them was, "I'm not a forensic specialist, but you're completely wrong, that ball's not fired." Well, you know what? He's completely wrong, because that ball was fired. And he said in his post that it's not deformed. It had, everything hits something you fire. That's not true. You don't always hit your target. And the ball that we found were all fired, but they were overshot. So they were fired and just landed they reached terminal velocity and landed in the soft ground. But that one, you can see where the windage pushed that ball to the bottom of the barrel and it scraped all the way out of the gun. There were 2 out of the 5 with that banding, that compression banding on it. That was one of my favorite balls. So we got to go into the arms that were used. So this is a British, these are the British muskets. You got a pattern 1769 short-land musket, and you have a British pattern 1756 long-land musket. Other than some cosmetic differences, the only difference is the barrel length. The short land is 42 inches and the long land is 46 inches. The bore on these are all slightly different. You can talk to people, they say they're all 75. They were not. The barrels were made out of flat stock and welded around a mandrel and bored. So we did a sampling of 100 original guns, and they all vary slightly. Here's an original pattern 56 that was captured on April 19th. After the British fired on Captain John Parker's Lexington Minute Company, the British marched on towards Concord, and at the end of the column was a drunken grenadier. And Joshua Simmons from Captain Parker's company captured him. And he said that he used this gun for the rest of the day, and then at the end of the day, he turned it into Captain Parker. And if you look on the top of the barrel, you can see those little markings next to the grenadier. It says 43 and REGT for the 43rd Regiment. So I was digging through some documents at Mass Archives I had found, and I found this petition from British soldiers who were captured and in the Concord jail. And if you look at the bottom right, you can see Samuel Colton, 43rd Regiment, and you see Duncan MacDonald, also with the 43rd. So checking the muster rolls, Samuel Colton was a member of the Light Infantry Company. The Light Infantry Company would carry the shorter guns, the pattern 1769s. Duncan MacDonald was the only grenadier captured on April 19th from the 43rd Regiment. So there's a good chance he's our drunken grenadier. So British musket balls, this is also important to understanding the bullet holes. British muskets were to carry 14 ball per pound. So it's not like today necessarily where we would talk about a caliber. They did everything by ball per pound, but they did have a chart in some of their manuals that laid it out. You can see here 14 ball per pound is .693. Now were all the musket balls .693? No. So not only have we studied every musket ball that's found archaeologically or in historical societies from April 19th, but we've studied found musket balls at a lot of different sites. And I spent my Easter weekend going through 12 trays of musket balls at Fort Ticonderoga and cataloging them so we could add more to our database. So the ball sizes found archaeologically range between .67 and .72, with an average of .68. The ball on the right-hand side is an April 19th ball. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. The lower one, which we used as samples, there were a bunch of British musket balls found at a Caribbean fort site, and we know that it was only occupied by the British during the Revolution. So we've used those as our kind of main sample as far as known British musket balls. So as far as provincial arms, that's a little different. Provincial arms are all over the place. They're carrying all sorts of different guns. One of the ones that, from studying the extant documents and extant originals and the archaeology, that was more commonly carried than any is the provincial fowling piece or hunting gun. Most of the time, very long barrels like this one. This was owned by Robert Chaffin of Acton, and it was cut back. The stock was cut back a little bit so it could accept a bayonet for his militia service. These three are also April 19th guns. The top one was carried by Roger Brown, who was from Framingham, Mass. The middle one is actually Captain John Parker's gun that he carried on April 19th. The barrel was shortened in the 19th century. And the lower one was Samuel Dakin of Lincoln, Mass. And his barrel was also shortened sometime in the 19th century. So the British also commented on some of the provincial guns. And you can see that top ball has fantastic banding also. The These fellows were generally good marksmen, and many of them used long guns made for duck shooting. And an officer at Bunker Hill wrote, their firelocks are very long, some near 7 feet. So what they're talking about is civilian hunting guns being carried. This newspaper article was actually printed in the English papers, and in December of 1774, it was reprinted in the American papers. It says, besides the regular trained militia in New England, all the planters' sons and servants are taught to use the fowling piece from their youth, and generally fire single balls with great exactness at fowl or beast. A gentleman well acquainted with that country is confident that the 4 provinces can muster upwards of 12,000 of these marksmen in 48 hours. Now, I think they exaggerated how good the marksmanship was, but they weren't too far off on how many men they could muster very quickly. There are also guns that we as collectors call Massachusetts parts guns or Frankenstein guns. There were a lot of guns being built here from parts. So they'd be reusing old parts, some from even 17th century guns. And this particular gun is using a French lock, an old French lock, French barrel, and then some locally made parts and a maple stock. This gun was carried by John Gordon from Stowe, Massachusetts. He marched on April 19th, but Stowe didn't make it to the fight, but he was then mortally wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here's another gun. This is an example of one because we don't have this exact gun, but lost in the Battle of Menotomy by Nathan Putnam, who was then badly wounded, a French musket. Marked D, number 6, with a marking iron on the breech. Said Putnam carried it to a crossroads near a mill. Now that was in Arlington, what's modern day Arlington, near Cutter's Mill, which is diagonally across the street from the Jason Russell House. Whoever has said gun in possession is desired to return it to Colonel Mansfield of Lynn, or the selectmen of Danvers, and they should be well rewarded for their trouble. So what they're talking about there is more than likely the French Model 1728 infantry musket. Thousands of them were captured during the French and Indian War and were for sale. You can find newspaper articles all over the place of these guns being sold. And Putnam never got his gun back, because I found this at Mass Archives, and he was actually paid in December of 1775 for his wounds, as well as his firelock, which he never got back. So one of the biggest things that I hear on TV shows and in books is that it was ironic that the militia, Minutemen, and the British were all carrying the same muskets. That is not true. There were a lot of English arms that were being sold commercially, and gun parts in Boston before the arms embargo of late 1774. But the last shipment of military arms that came to the province of Massachusetts was in 1755, sent over for Governor Shirley, basically for the spring campaigns of 1756 at Crown Point. And you can see this document from the Public Records Office in London, land muskets of the King's pattern with double bridle locks and wood rammers. And what they're talking about are British pattern 1742 long land muskets. Here is an example below. This one is marked with what we think are Massachusetts markings on the wrist plate. So this may have been one of those 2,000 guns. Now, when they were issued out in 1756, a lot of them walked away. There's an order that goes out that anyone who doesn't return their guns is going to get charged for it, or they're pay docked. And there's a lot of guys that write in and say, hey, I turned my gun in and it had these markings on it. So because of those documents, we can tell that it is definitely the pattern 1742 that they had. But again, very few of these would have been in provincial hands on April 19th. Now, this was a great document I found on the back of another document at Mass Archives. And it says the number of bullets to a pound each gun carries in Captain Turner's company. And if you look on the left, you see the number 12 ball per pound, 13, 14, all the way up. So the larger number obviously is the larger number is the smaller ball, and on the left, the smaller number is the bigger ball. So you've got some 14 ball per pound in there, which could be some King's arms, some commercial arms possibly. You get up into the 12s, that could be an old 17th century gun barrel reused, or it could be an old Dutch musket. But if you look in the middle, you see the 20, 22, 26, 28. Those are more than likely fowling pieces. So that company had a lot of fowling pieces in it. So in November of 2019, I went to visit the Jason Russell House in Arlington. I had been there hundreds of times, but I went to look at some objects that they had in their collection and started looking at the bullet holes again in the house. And as I started to look at them, I would look at a bullet hole and say, wait a minute, if it went here, it had to go there. And we started to find a whole bunch more bullets that they didn't know had struck the house. So I called Dr. Scott, and he said, yeah, let's do this. Let's do a whole study of everything we can find. So it included the structure, but also other structures and objects that were bullet struck on the 19th. So one of the things we're going to do is use modern forensic techniques to better understand the bullet strikes that we're seeing, which means ballistics rods, lasers, theodolites, so that we can actually line up the shots. Obviously, we know the types of balls that are being fired, and we can identify with some consistency who fired the shots. But this was very important to using this new technology. Well, new technology for people who do historic stuff, not for the police. So we decided to start basically going from the British retreat. So the first shot that we had is the Elisha Jones house, more commonly known today as the Bullet Hole House in Concord. And it's just on the east side of the North Bridge here. And as a kid, I was very good friends with the superintendent's son. He used to play in there and look at that bullet hole all the time. So from the time I was about 8. But anyway, if you look next to the window here, you can see there's a little triangle there, and I'll show a close-up of it. The Elisha Jones shed, which that was actually to the north or to the left. It wasn't attached to the house at the time. In 1865, it was moved up and attached, and Judge Keyes, who owned the property, added that little carriage section to the left and raised it up so he had a little bowling alley for his kids above it. And this is a wonderful image of Concordian Margaret Thornton in 1934, who went to visit that bullet hole, just like I had as a kid. And here it is today behind a little piece of plexiglass, and the hole size is .71, so it's consistent with being fired from a British musket. And then if you look at the other side, that's what's called feather edge sheathing, and you can see where the ball came through. That stud to the left was replaced in 1865. That was gouged out with probably a chisel so that you could see the hole. That's not from the original bullet. In this shot, you can see where the white arrow is, what the feather edge sheathing actually looked like before it was struck with a bullet. And on the right side with the two arrows, you can see where when the bullet struck, it blew the fragments of wood out the back. So how do we test something like that? Shoot it up. So we had, due to the generosity of Neil and Anna Rasmussen of Concord, they had a whole bunch of pieces of 18th century sheathing from about the 1720s and studs, and they had their carpenters build these for me so that we could shoot them up. So you can see it strike, you can see that big chunk blow out the back, some other smaller fragments. And the lower section, you can see where it blew the feather edge sheathing out. Now, one thing that I didn't anticipate, obviously with the windage, you don't know exactly where you're going to hit, but he hit right on the edge of a knot also. So it was very hard, and it blew that big chunk out. So the next one is Acton's own James Hayward. Obviously, the British retreated from Concord, were on their way back. And James Hayward stopped purportedly to get a drink at the well and ran into a British soldier. And the first account of that is April 25th, 1775 in the newspapers. Mr. James Howard or Hayward and one of the regulars discharged their pieces at the same instant and each killed each other. Now, there was nobody there to witness this event, but Rebecca Fisk was the daughter-in-law of Benjamin Fisk, who owned the house. And prior to the battle, she had taken her elderly father-in-law away, and then she came back after the battle had passed to see what had happened. And Rebecca Fisk wrote a great account. It's a lot longer than this, obviously. I can't word you to death, but she wrote that she had seen a dead British soldier on the front steps with the blood still warm from being killed. There were 2 wounded British soldiers inside of her house, and the third was a young American employing his dying breath in prayer. A bullet had passed through his body, taking off in its course the lower part of his powder horn. The name of this youthful patriot was J. Hayward of Acton. His father came and carried his body home, and it now lies in the Acton graveyard. And obviously, most of you know, it lies right across the street now in the monument. I knew in the 1980s that there was a portrait that had survived of Rebecca Fisk, and it was sold at Grogan Auctions in Boston, and I had no clue where it went. And I had heard a rumor that it was in Concord somewhere, but I could never find out who had it. And last February, all of a sudden my phone lit up, and it appeared at auction. So I called a bunch of friends to get them on bidding on this thing, and it ended up going to Sturbridge Village. And it's a wonderful portrait of Rebecca Fisk, but one of the great things about it, if you look, it's a painting inside of a painting. And April 19th was such an important event for her that in her portrait, she had painted the incident with James Hayward and the British soldier. A very allegorical way of doing it, but still, you know. So that's why I really wanted to find that portrait. It's absolutely fantastic. So here's Hayward's powder horn. The Acton Library was gracious enough to let us go in and study and photograph it. It's got a .70-inch hole, which is consistent with a British musket. The plug and the silver pieces were added by Stevens Hayward in the 19th century. The original plug was probably blown out. And it's one of those reminders of April 19th. It's not a piece of wood. You know, this is someone who was mortally wounded and died pretty quickly, and we'll see in a way why. Because we're going to shoot a powder horn, and ballistics gelatin. And between the powder horn and the ballistics gelatin, we took imported English cloth to emulate a coat lining, waistcoat lining, and a linen shirt. And we taped that to the ballistics gelatin, and we prayed that the shooter would be able to hit it, because hitting the powder horn is really hard with one of these guns. And he hit it. Not in the same spot, but we were happy with it. But if you look at that ballistics gelatin block, that thing jumps almost off the table, and you can see how it destroyed that powder horn. We did this twice, and actually the shooter hit the horn twice. I can't see anymore, so I had someone else do the shooting. And when we got back to my house that night, to the chagrin of my wife, we had the ballistics gelatin blocks on the kitchen counter, and we just started to dice them up so that we could pull out what would have gone into Hayward's body, including the ball, which happened to split in this case when it hit the horn. But all that cloth and those horn fragments were inside the ballistics gelatin. So you can just imagine what that ball and what this did to his body. And even if he had a chance to survive, he probably would have died from blood poisoning because of all the fragments that would have been stuck inside of him. Pretty gruesome. But then came up the Hayward pump, and this is something that had bothered me for a long time. A friend of mine that I used to work with in the 80s and 90s was a direct descendant of Stevens Hayward, and he had a book published in 1912 of the Hayward-Barney family history. And in there were these pictures of the Fisk house, which is gone now. Obviously, if you've been out there, you can see it's just a foundation. And you can see the pump that Hayward supposedly stopped to get a drink. So I was showing a friend from Lexington this photo, and he said, you know, I think the Lexington Historical Society has a pump in their barn. I went, okay, let's go check it out. So I contacted Lexington, we went over and we dug through the barn, and on the second floor, we found the pump. So this is the day that we found it, and I dragged it outside and got a picture of it. In 2018, I was giving a talk at Colonial Williamsburg on April 19th artifacts, and the curators were furiously writing things down. And they ended up reaching out to Lexington and Acton, and Lexington was able to conserve the pump, and they lent it to the Museum of the American Revolution so all the visitors to Philadelphia could see it. And here you have the pump and the powder horn together for the first time since 1775. So that was very nice of Acton and Lexington to loan it to the museum. But it also got a lot of people around the world to be able to see this stuff and realize how important it is. We were doing an archaeology conference in Philadelphia, and we had a reception at the museum, and I spent my entire night in there talking to people that would walk through about these objects. And we have Isaac Davis's sword right next to it, too. And that gun on the other side is Captain David Brown's. He lived on the west side of the North Bridge and carried that on April 19th. So like a lot of the people, as we see when we go down Battle Road, bless you, a lot of the people who had damaged their house or things stolen put in petitions to the state for payment. So I've gone through and found all those petitions, and this one was for Benjamin Fisk. For all the things taken, you can see the third one down, one sash window. One of the British soldiers broke through the window to get into the house. The next house, the British retreat from here, go down into Lexington Center, and the next house is the Merritt Monroe, which is just on the right-hand side of the green if you're coming down into Lexington. You can see it in this detail from the Doolittle engraving of the British soldiers marching by to Concord. And that's what it looks like today. It's had extensive work done to it. The whole back is an addition, which wasn't there in 1775. But on April 19th, there was a British soldier in the backyard who fired up through a window, and a musket ball lodged in the roof rafter inside. And it's privately owned, so I kind of hounded this guy for a while and get into the house. And you can see, here's the rafter, and you can see all these little things that look like plaster. Well, right here is the musket ball hole where it hit, and someone filled it in with plaster at some point. And you can see a little upside-down V above it, and it looks like someone had pried the musket ball out and broke off a little chunk of the wood. And that becomes even more apparent when you see the musket ball that came out of it. You can see that little gouge mark on the top. That would have been from whatever tool the person used to pluck it out. And you can see the pieces of oak that are still embedded in the musket ball. And that is consistent with a British musket ball. We weighed it and used the formula that we have to figure out what a caliber is on a ball. And that came out as .70, so it's definitely a British musket ball. But a lot of the things we used in this research, too, are newspaper searches. They're really important. You can find out so much from searching newspapers. And I found this. And it's hard to read on this little screen. I'm used to using a bigger screen, so I'll read it to you. Inside, the workmen found 2 bullet holes, one on the right of the front door and the other in the roof. In the latter case, the bullet was traced to where it had embedded itself in the heavy timber. Apparently, both shots were fired in the Battle of Lexington. Bullet holes have been found in the Buckman Tavern, they spelled it Buckram, on the other side of the Battle Green, but it was not known until yesterday that the Monroe house had been hit. So this is in 1915 when that musket ball was found. So Merritt Monroe, who owned the house, also put in a petition for the things stolen and damaged when the British came through, and he got 5 pounds and 6 pence for everything that was damaged. But he also lost a gun and a hat. He's the last one down on that top little section that's inset. 2 pounds and 8 shillings. He ended up being paid 2 pounds and 2 shillings for his gun and hat that were taken from him. So just diagonally across the street is the Buckram or Buckman Tavern, as it really is called. And from about where I took this picture, a British soldier fired at the front of the house and hit the front door. You can see the ballistics rod, the orange ballistics rod. You can see it came in at an angle. The door is actually displayed on a hinge inside the Buckman Tavern now, so you can swing, it's in a case, but we swung it out so we could actually look at both sides of the bullet strike. And here's the opposite side. You can see the wood blowout from the .69 caliber ball that hit it. And you can also see remnants of plaster. So after it was struck, they just filled the hole with plaster and kept using the door. You're going to see that coming up, too, in a lot of the other structures and objects. So, again, doing a newspaper search, after I had studied the door, I found this. In the house owned by the family of the late Reverend Caleb Stetson of Lexington is a bullet hole made at the battle, April 19th, 1775. Though nearly 100 years ago, all the clapboards around the hole are in a good state of preservation. So I emailed Lexington Historical and said, hey, do you have something else other than the door? And they responded back and said, oh, yeah, we have a clapboard with a bullet hole in it. So we're able to study that, and it is consistent with being fired from a British ball. And again, I think a lot of these shots all these shots came from the British retreat, not from the firing in the morning. So just after Lexington Center, headed towards Arlington, Menotomy at the time, Lord Percy, the British relief force of about 1,000 men arrived with 2 pieces of artillery, two 6-pounders. And Reverend William Gordon wrote, but a little on this side of Lexington Meeting House, where they were met by the brigade with cannon under Lord Percy, the scene changed. And the scene really did change. As if the fighting wasn't heavy enough prior to this time, it became even heavier and more horrific. When Percy's troops arrived, they were very angry with what had happened, but on the other side you have all the provincials that are angry, and it makes for a really ugly day. So this is another great Doolittle engraving from Woburn Street in Lexington. You can see Mass Ave in the distance with the troops marching. That's Percy's Relief coming in, and Lieutenant Colonel Smith's column that had been in Concord marching towards them. And the British came in and destroyed all the structures in that area. And they took up the Monroe Tavern in Lexington as their temporary headquarters. You can see it here. It's now the archives and part of the Museum of the Lexington Historical Society. Great place if you haven't been there. But purportedly, from about where I was standing when I took the picture, a British soldier fired a shot that went through one of the windows and hit the taproom ceiling, and it was preserved. Other accounts in the newspapers talking about more bullet strikes in the house, one in some wainscoting, but after a search of the house, at some point the wainscoting was probably removed, so the other bullet strikes are gone, and that's the same with a lot of these places. Buckman Tavern, and some of the others have more bullet holes that we'll probably never know about. But sadly.
Were a lot of these shots just the British shooting at the house to shoot at?
We're going to get there in 2 seconds. Good, that's good, that's good. No, we're going to get there in a minute. So William Monroe, who owned Monroe Tavern, had this portrait of his father, William Monroe, on the wall. And although William Monroe had died in 1747, a British soldier fired at the painting and shot him in the arm. This painting was passed down through the family and donated to the Lexington Historical Society in the 1880s or 90s. They badly conserved it, which is great, because if they had conserved it, tried to hide it, we wouldn't know it was there. But it is consistent size-wise with being fired from a British musket. And William Monroe had a lot of losses that day. You can see the amount of money that he's got listed, and in the 18th century, that's a big loss. So they looted his house, destroyed a bunch of stuff, and left him with a big mess to clean up. So here's where we get into your question. So this is a great letter a friend of mine owns from an unknown British officer in the 4th Regiment of Foot. And he writes, "From eagerness, you would see a party of soldiers firing at the front of a house and another on its rear, whilst the main body were pelting away at the upper windows, by which means many of our own people fell, even after they were in the house, and all the world could not prevent it." So the British soldiers are firing it at any place they can be shot at from. So they're shooting at windows, doors, everything they can. But at the same time, they have British soldiers trying to get into the houses and shooting from the outside, and they're shooting each other by mistake. Yeah, it got really messy. In this same letter, which is absolutely fantastic, this officer writes, "In one of those sallies, I had a very narrow escape, having a grenadier of the 5th, a soldier of ours, and a Marine killed all around me. But we soon got into the house, and I counted 11 dead Yankees in it in the orchard. One villain had 73 balls in his bag and 2 horns of powder." So the house he's talking about with the orchard, where these men were killed, is the Jason Russell house in what's now Arlington. And you can tell by what he says about the 5th, a grenadier of the 5th, a soldier of ours, and a Marine killed all around me. There was no command and control. These are all guys from different units going with this officer into the house. And he also miscounted. There was another dead soldier, Lieutenant John Bacon from Needham, who was killed behind the barn, which he didn't see. So he didn't keep that into his final count of 11 there. After the 12 men were found on the property, they were brought into the Jason Russell house and laid out on the kitchen floor. And one of the guys who came through after the fight, just after, was Amos Farnsworth from Groton. They had marched, they had received the alarm a little bit later than the other companies and didn't actually fight, but they came through right afterwards. And he talks about what he saw along the way. He also says he went into a house where the blood was half over his shoes. So now there's another account, supposedly from Jason Russell's wife, that said that she came in and the blood was ankle deep. It probably is more likely that that got changed around from this quote from Amos Farnsworth. And here's the Jason Russell house. I'm sure many of you have been there. Owned by the Arlington Historical Society, and their museum is attached to it. As I said, as a kid and up through my adult life, I've been through it numerous times and looked at the bullet holes, but hadn't really thought a whole heck of a lot about it until we started doing all the shooting and you know, looking at where things went. And so we started our ballistic study on the north parlor on the downstairs floor. Here's Doug Scott with a ballistics rod in one of the holes in the paneling. The shot came through the window or just beside the window. It went through this paneling, through some lath and plaster, and it hit the newel post in the stairwell and skipped off. It probably went out the front door or hit the front door. And in this endoscope video that I did, you can see that it entered fairly round, but by the time the bullet left, it was almost football shaped. By the time it had gotten through the panel. So what do? Shoot. Oh, what happened? Sorry about that. Got a little hair trigger here on the... So anyway, we shot through it. Here's the ball entrance. And we have the ball exit. Now that plaster was original 1727 plaster that had been removed from a house. It had been used in a reconstruction, and this was a piece that was going to get thrown away. So we figured we'd put it to better use and shoot it. So we shot it a few times with the same results. They all had that little oval shape when we were done. Upstairs, the parlor chamber, a shot had come through the window, and the laser went right out to Mass Ave. So it was probably someone firing from the main body, and we didn't want to keep the laser out the window pointed to Mass Ave, so we put a Post-it where it was, so you can see that yellow Post-it. That's where the ball had come through based upon the using the ballistics rods. So again, you can see Mass Ave right there. You can see that the shot probably came from the main column. And it hit that panel, and it went through the panel, and there was a little secret closet on the other side. And I was a little too Rubenesque to get up inside. So we made Mary Jane Balicki do it, who's a great archaeologist and who could fit. And there's her feet kind of dangling out. And she was barely able to get up in there, but she could get her phone turned so she could get a picture of the backside of that bullet hole in the paneling. You can see the typical wood blowout, but it also hit near a knot, so there's a big chunk that popped out. But the other thing that she could see is where that bullet reached its terminal velocity on the attic stair riser, right there. And we were also doing where we could presumptive lead tests. So we would test the area. We couldn't do painted surfaces, obviously, because of lead paint, but we tested this area and it came back as positive for lead. So then there was a soldier on the outside, on the south side of the house, opposite Mass Ave, who was firing at that middle window. And he hit about right there. The ball went through the other side, and you can see the laser beam just above the wood blowout. That laser was across the room where the bullet hit next, and it went right back to that spot. So you could see exactly where the shot came in and where it went out. Here it is up close, again filled with plaster. They just filled it in. And it went across the room, hit the paneling, came out the other side, and then struck the roof and skipped off. Now, the other story about the Jason Russell house is that there were a bunch of guys from Beverly, Mass, who had got trapped in the basement of the house and couldn't get out by the time the British got in, and that they were shooting through the cellar door and trying to shoot these guys from Beverly, and the Beverly guys were shooting back and actually killed one of the British soldiers there. And some of the bullet holes still exist. The door is replaced, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Right inside the door jamb, you could see where a bullet had gone through, probably hit the trim on the door, came through, hit the stair riser, and then it came out the other side. And another one had gone through the door and hit the stair riser, it hit the overlap of this riser, and then went through the next stair riser. And you can see them both here with the typical wood blowout that we see, and they would have ended up in the lath and plaster on the opposite side of the wall. And I tested that with a metal detector. There were no musket balls, but you could see that the lath and plaster had been replaced probably in the early 20th century. Then, again, like we were talking about with the British soldiers shooting at the windows of the houses, the attic on the north side window, the sheathing hadn't been replaced. There were some areas in the attic that the sheathing had been, had to be replaced from rot. But these were original, and right below the window were 2 bullet holes. So they were shooting again at all the windows they could shoot at to try and kill anybody that might shoot back at them. Then here's one I didn't even see for a while, because it's an 18th century house, it's very dark. And I thought that this second spot right here was another peg for the tenon on that handrail, but it wasn't. It only needed one tenon. The tenon only went in so far. That's actually a bullet hole. British soldier from down below fired up the stairs, hit that post, and on the other side, it didn't go all the way out because it would have gone through the wall on the other side. So they probably pried the ball out because it was sticking through with splinters and then filled it with plaster afterwards, like the rest of them. But that one, we almost missed it. So through the generosity of Feldman Geospatial, they donated 3D laser scanning to us for this project. So they went through and scanned the whole house and property, which enabled us to have some great views that we normally wouldn't, including this kind of cutaway of the house where you can see what it looked like inside, and you can see in the attic or the garret, you can see where the sheathing was replaced on the roof. So you could see there's newer sheathing in there with some of the older. But it also enabled us to put this together. The trajectory analysis of all the bullets that we found fired at the house. So all the white lines are all of the balls are bullet holes that we found, multiples with certain shots. You can see the two attic shots on the upper right, the one that went through the window and hit the attic stair riser. You can see the lower that came through the wall or window, hit the paneling, and then skipped off the newel post. And you can see the kitchen parlor shot going up at an angle, and the two that were fired that we could find into the cellar door, which came out the other side of the stair risers. But this really helps to give it more of a human element when you really see what's going on here. A bunch of guys in the house that are provincial, a bunch of British shooting at the house, people are shooting inside the house. It was just a horrific scene. So Geophysical Survey Systems, Inc. also donated GPR survey for us to do the property. Because there was a question as to the house being moved. And what does that matter? Well, if the house is moved, all of our trajectories won't really be correct as to where they came from. And we couldn't find anything that stated the house had ever been moved. But everybody that I talked to said, well, the house was moved. It's like, well, based upon what? Well, I don't know, but the house was moved. It's like, well, can you provide some information? Nope, but the house was moved. So it had been said over and over again so many times that everybody believed it. But the report that we had done basically states that GSSI's analysis revealed no evidence that the Jason Russell house was relocated to its current location. But what did happen to it was Robert Nylander wrote about the Jason Russell house in 1964, and he said that after Russell Teal, who was a descendant, sold the house and it passed out of the family, they picked it up off the foundation, they put a furnace in, rebuilt the chimney, and set it back down again. And we could find evidence of that on the foundation when we started looking at the mortar that was used to clean up the top of the foundation when they set it back down. You could see the lime cement that they had used. And then below that, you could see some of the earlier 18th century mortar that was used. So it was basically picked up and set back down again. So our trajectories were good, hopefully. So just down the street was the Captain William Adams house to the east, and that wonderful, wonderful daguerreotype with a scary tree out in front of it. That's what I used to call him as a kid. That house in 1846, they started to take down part of the back of it for the railroad to go through, and the owner of the house was selling artifacts that he found in the house. It was shot up so bad. The owner of the estate, Mr. Josiah Russell, takes pains to secure every bullet found in the building and disposes of them at the rate of $1 each. Yesterday afternoon, a small piece of clapboard, which had been perforated by a bullet, was sold for half a dollar. Now, in 1846 and 1855, that's a decent amount of money for a musket ball. I think you can still buy one at a Gettysburg shop for like $3. So that was a lot of money to have a musket ball that had been fired on April 19th. And some of those pieces that were sold survive. Here's one that was struck at an angle. Don't know who fired it, don't know who fired the shot, but that ended up being donated to the Arlington Historical Society. And here's one of the door panels that was fired on, a front door panel from the Captain William Adams house in Arlington, pierced by a British bullet, April 19th, 1775. But the hole in the door panel is 0.60 inch. and you can see where it went in and the opposite side where it blew out. That's more than likely not a British bullet, but a provincial fowling piece that it was basically an overshot that went through the door panel. And the house was shot up by both sides. They weren't focusing on whose house was going to get hit by a musket ball. They were just trying to kill each other. And there's another great image with a tree looking a little less scary with leaves on it where you can see what the house looked like. Another relic was this bullet, which I found at the Arlington Historical Society in a little glass 19th century jar, which is wicked cool, with the iron gall ink on the label, with a .63 caliber. It's so deformed that it could be British or it could be provincial. Hard to say. We don't know how much it lost when it struck whatever it struck. But they wrote, the newspapers wrote, they have just pulled down the old building at the corner, which is full of bullets from both sides. They split up the boards and sold the bullets for $1 a piece. On the northwest side, of course, the bullets were those of the advancing Americans. On the south side, the retreating English. So you could buy a Whig or Tory bullet at your pleasure. So just up the road from the Captain William Adams house was the Amos Whittemore house, which is actually the 19th century owner. But I found this shutter in the basement of the Arlington Historical Society, and it had been struck. You could see where the ball went through the panel and blew the thinner wood out on the bottom, and then you can see the wood blow out on the back after it had gone through, and it had this note tacked to it. Shutters taken from the Amos Whittemore house, which stood on the site of the Florence, Mass Ave. Bullet holes showing where the British fired into the house as they retreated April 19, 1775. So as I mentioned, Amos Whittemore didn't live in that house in 1775. He didn't live there until about 1800. But doing some research on the property sales, we know that Ebenezer Fisk owned it and that he rented it to his son. And there's a great account written by his wife with all the battle damage, talking about the house being shot up. We also found another shutter in the basement. It's a bifold. And you can see on the left, you can see the bullet entrance where it went through and blew out a little chunk of wood at the top. And then on the right, you can see where it blew the back out. And you can also see where there are remnants of plaster, where they had plastered over it and just reused the bifold shutter. And we looked at it a little closer, and we ended up finding 3 more plastered over bullet holes. So they really shot up that house bad. So we ended up having to shoot a shutter. We shot it multiple times. And here are the 2 entrance holes, one on the lower left and the upper one you can see. And then the other side where it blew the wood out. We'll probably shoot this one a few more times since we've got more shutter to shoot at. I've kept all these house sections in pieces so that we can do some more study. So there are also a bunch of missing objects. So in going through the newspapers and other places, trying to track down some of the missing bullet-struck artifacts. In this newspaper article is talking about the cellar door for the Jason Russell house in the kitchen. And in the article, it states it was shot full of bullet holes by the British, and it was during the time when repairs were made, which was 1895, upon the house, that it was taken away and replaced with a new cellar door, and that's the door that's there now. And in the newspaper article, they thought that it might have gone to Chelsea or Charlestown, so they put an ad in the papers trying to get it back, and they never did. Nobody knows where that door is now or if it even survives. Another one, back to Merritt Monroe's house. I found this newspaper article. To the west of the Common is the Monroe House, built in 1728. A bullet passed through the glass over the door and embedded itself in a bureau. The bureau, bullet and all, is in the possession of one of Monroe descendants in Chicopee, Mass. So I found a Monroe descendant website, reached out to the folks. They knew about this and they mentioned it on their website, but nobody knew where this thing was. So I reached out to the Chicopee Historical Society to see if they knew anything, and they never responded. So no idea where it is now. Another one that we found in the newspapers was this one from 1844, and it was basically stating that there was a shutter in Glasgow, Scotland, with a bullet hole in it that had come out of a house in Lexington on April 19th. And they were trying to figure out where it may have came from. And they stated in the paper, a window shutter supposed to contain the perforation of the first musket ball fired in the contest. Probably not the first musket ball fired in the contest. However, probably from the British retreat as they came back through, like the others. And doing some research at Lexington Historical Society was this unpublished manuscript by Levi Harrington, who was there on April 19th as a kid, witnessed what had happened, but he lived in Lexington his entire life, and he saw everything and seemed to notice everything that was going on in town. And he wrote that a notice appeared in the newspaper in the year 1845, stating that a shutter perforated by a ball taken by a gentleman from Buckman's Tavern soon after the war was in Scotland, and that if the circumstance could be authenticated, it would be a most valuable relic. The undersigned distinctly remembers that a man came here and took away a shutter from Buckman's Tavern. It was on the small shop attached to the house, and he has no doubt that this is the same shutter referred to by the newspaper above mentioned. So in his manuscript was the same newspaper article glued above that section. So Levi Harrington seemed to know, that's the shutter I saw being removed. So we reached out to every museum in Glasgow. Nobody knew what we were talking about, thought we were crazy. And then we reached out through Doug Scott to his archaeological buddies over there, the conflict archaeology folks, and nobody could find it. So don't know whether it survives or not. Then another one that is pretty poignant would be Reuben Kennison's shirt. Now, Reuben Kennison was shot and killed on the Jason Russell House property. And after the battle, he was put in a cart and brought back to the town of Beverly where he lived. And his wife buried him, but she took his shirt off, put him in a new shirt, and she kept the shirt that he'd been shot through. Now, in the 19th century, as you can see here in this very wordy section, that's for you, Bob. The thing survived, and this author saw it. And in the late 19th century, it was donated to the Beverly Historical Society. And in contacting them, they said that all they had in their records that it was released from collections. So you didn't know what that meant. And then I remembered I had heard a rumor about a shirt fragment at the Danvers Historical Society. So I reached out to them and I got, no, we don't know what the heck you're talking about. No idea. And a search of Google Books, I found that it was mentioned and it was listed as one of their artifacts in 1975. And I kept emailing them saying, hey, can we try and figure out where this thing is? And they said, we don't know what you're talking about, and stopped responding to me. So, not everybody liked my inquests, I guess. But this is one of the shirt fragments. In case we ever came up with it, we've shot other things too so that we can have that data. Another great one, which I knew about and I had forgotten, was in Frank Warren Coburn's great book on Battle of April 19th, 1775. And it's basically a chest on chest that was owned by Samuel Shedd, who lived in Charlestown, which is now, that section is Somerville. And he mentions a little way further, along the northerly side of the road stood the home of Samuel Shedd. Percy's troops halted there for the few moments necessary to turn his field pieces on his pursuers again. While there, one of the Britons, ambitious for plunder, entered the Shedd's home. And finding there a bureau or highboy filled with household effects, commenced the work of selecting what he desired. It took him too long, for his companions passed on, and left him too busy to notice their departure or the coming of the Americans. Bullets came through the window, one of which killed him, and 3 riddled the old bureau, spattered with his blood. The old highboy was in existence in 1910 and treasured by a Somerville man, Francis Tuft, to whom it had descended. I have seen it, with its blood stains and 3 bullet holes. So that was in 1912 when Frank Warren Coburn saw it. I reached out to the Somerville Historical Society, and they mentioned, yes, we know where it is. I said, okay. So this is during COVID, and they reached out to the owner, and the owner said, reach back out to us in 6 months when you see what's going on. So I did that, and then I gradually started getting no responses from anybody at the Somerville Historical Society, which kind of bummed me out because I really wanted to see this thing. But we know it exists, don't know exactly where it is. So then, the Friday before Christmas, a new find popped up. sitting on the couch having a cocktail with my wife, and all of a sudden, the phone lights up again. And it's a bunch of friends who found this popping up for auction at McGinnis Auctioneers up in Amesbury. And it's a 4-inch by 2-inch piece of clapboard from the Captain William Adams house with a very weathered bullet hole on it. Now, you can see here is more than likely the exit. It was framed in this mahogany case with glass. And it was owned by Jared Sparks, who was a minister. He was also a historian and the president of Harvard College. And in 1855, more than likely, he bought this because that is actually his autograph. I checked his handwriting, and that was definitely his. But if we go back to that newspaper article I showed a little while ago, it says, yesterday afternoon, a small piece of clapboard, which had been perforated by a bullet, was sold for $50. So it seems like this 4 by 2-inch piece of clapboard may have been the one that was purchased for $50. So I continued to watch daily what this thing was bringing. And before Christmas, it was $2,750. Right after Christmas, it was $4,750. And if you see that little flame below play split bid, that says 77 bidders are watching this item. Now, normally I can tell you from auctions that if you have like 15 to 20 people on there, that's a good sign. When you have 77, that's insane. I went up there to see it and measure it and photograph it on January 2nd, and the auction was on January 4th. So I sat in my kitchen watching it, and it sold for $25,000 plus 25% buyer's premium. So basically $30,000 for a 4-inch by 2-inch piece of clapboard that was shot on April 19th. Crazy. And at that time, when I was watching it, when it sold, there were 84 bidders watching it. And the underbidder was a friend of mine, and he was kicking himself for not getting it, but at the same time, he was kicking himself for bidding that high. Not yet, I haven't heard yet. And I told the auction house the work that I had done, and if they could give my info to whoever the high bidder was, because they can't give you the info. You know, it's against the law, it's privacy. But I'm hoping that whoever it is will reach out to me at some point, because everybody was calling and asking me afterwards if I knew who. I thought one of them bought it. And they're all going, do you know who did? I didn't get it, It was crazy watching it go. So all of this and then some, except the videos, because you obviously can't put those in a book, is in our new book that Doug Scott and I wrote called Bullet Strikes on the First Day of the American Revolution. And I had hoped to have some copies here, but it's sitting on a ship in New York Harbor right now waiting for a berth to unload. So I'm hoping, the publisher promises me that it should be here by next Friday, a week from Friday. So I'm hopeful that they will be here and we can start to get them out, because we put a lot of work and a lot of money into this. We did it because we love it and we love the history, but I'd really like to share some more of it and have the books out so that people can see it. It's basically the bullet strikes, history of the firearms and such like we talked about, some of the live fire studies that we've done. We've also put in there all of the information about the extant musket balls from April 19th that we've studied and found, from Parker's Revenge and what belongs in the Concord Museum, Arlington Historical Society, Lexington Historical Society, and Minuteman National Park. We're going to have more to add to that list, hopefully in the spring when we're allowed to announce it from another archaeology project. There's also musket bore data from all the muskets that we studied, so that you can see the differences in variation of the bore size. There's primary accounts, all the loss returns I transcribed and put in there. So there's a lot more than just the bullet strike information. There's also a section in there about the burials in Arlington. When we had GSSI out there doing the GPR, they decided they would go over to the Arlington Cemetery with us and look at where we thought there were mass graves of British soldiers. And sure enough, the data came back with consistent for 2 mass graves right next to each other for where the British soldiers were buried. So I've written a whole section in there also about the British burials and the provincial burials on April 19th. And with the provincials, they were dug up in 1848 for the monument that's there today. And there were some artifacts taken out, which I found, which are photographed in there too. So there's a lot more information than we can fit in a talk. So hopefully you guys will like the book if you get it. All right. Thank you for being patient and letting me babble through all of this.
250-year-old musket balls for these tests?
No. But what we did do, we used new-made musket balls. But we did do was elemental analysis of the original balls, because we've done PXRF on all of the musket balls so far that we found, and checking the elements against what we're using in the new balls. And they're very, very close, basically soft lead.
Can you please repeat your questions when we get asked?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a microphone, I think.
Yes, let's hold on just a sec before we continue the Q&A. One of the pleasures of the Acton 250 group has been to strengthen partnerships with groups in town that tend not to work too closely together. So if we might just shift for a moment, I believe we have someone who wishes to speak on behalf of one of the groups.
Hi. I'm
When you were talking about the different muskets used, I recall from going to Ironworks Farm, actually, they were telling us that the Minutemen had used different guns than the, I guess, the irregulars that were.
So you're talking about, in the beginning of it, what I was saying is that the regulars had their arm. The regulars had their arm. You had to show up with a proper amount of ammunition and a pound of powder. So you had to show up with all these things to be a Minuteman, but you also needed to for your militia service. It was part of your service. And as far as guns go, not everybody could afford or get a gun in each town, and towns kept a stock of arms. So I'm sure Acton had one, Concord had one, every town did. And what they would do is they would loan the gun to the member of the Minutemen or militia for their service, and then it had crazy things with their jacketed bullets and ballistics rods and lasers and all that stuff. We don't need to do as much because we're not using some of these arms, but we've taken what they do and adapted it for what we're doing. And the guy who wrote that book I brought up, Lucian Haig, he's a very famous forensics guy. I've seen him on TV all over the place, and he's a wonderful person. He's best friends with Doug Scott, my colleague in all of this. So for 10 years, I decided I was going to go through every document at the Mass Archives from 1643 until 1799, every slip of paper. Thousands and thousands of hours. And then I've downloaded what I could download from the files that are online, cited and cataloged them into different folders. So I have canteens, knapsacks, arms. My arms folder is 5,000 documents right now. And I've incorporated newspapers and town documents into that also. Read it and then go through it all. And then I would take it and then go through it all. And then I would take, okay, here's 34 canteens issued to Captain whatever's company, and then I take each one of those and catalog it into a canteen folder or cartridge boxes. So there's just so much out there, and you can't always depend upon the internet. You know, you've got to still do old school digging, you know, for documents. No digging on the battlefield, it's illegal.
Any other questions over there? Anybody?
62 bore, so it's a smaller bore. And at 100 yards, we were hitting the target, and so every shot. And people were like, wait a minute, you're a horrible shot, let me do it. And my wife, she took it and hit the target every time. She's a much better shot than me, I wasn't insulting her, which is kind of scary that she's a better shot than me, but anyway. Yeah, but the muzzle velocity on that gun was also 1,425 feet per second as an average. That's a lot higher muzzle velocity, and maybe it has to do with the smaller bore and the barrel length, because the barrel is, you know, almost 10 inches longer than the King's Arms. So we started to realize that, you know, on April 19th, when they're firing, the provincials are firing a lot of these fowling pieces, they're probably able to hit a little bit better than some of the muskets are. Whether they're British arms or old French or, you know, Frankenstein guns, the fowling pieces are still pretty accurate. Where the fowling pieces fail is they're fragile, they're too long running around in the woods. You know, by the time you're done, the gun's my height. You know, so you're running around with this long gun, the wrist is really thin, it's not meant for soldiers to carry. It's meant for going out and hunting. So the wrists break, the guns break, and the bore really, for military use, is too small, to the point that during the Revolution, 76, 77, militia are showing up for service with these guns. By 77, 78, their guns are being taken away, and they're being given French arms that had arrived. And some of them are really pissed off, because they're like, my gun was much better than that French thing you gave me and made me pay for. So.
What's the time difference modern arms say you pull the trigger, bang, the bullet's out of the barrel, it's gone. In those days, it flashed.
So,
I mean, you literally had to hold that gun steady and accurate.
yeah. So I filmed a TV show for Nova in July, which is coming out in April, on the technology of the American Revolution. And we fired a British pattern 1756, and we fired a British Lee Enfield number 1 303 bolt-action rifle. And not only was obviously the muzzle velocity a lot higher, but it's going to go. You pull the trigger and boom, it's gone. With the muskets, it's not really a long period of time, but it feels like it. And what it does is, if you're not used to it, it gives you a chance to flinch. Where with a modern rifle, you're flinching after the bullet's already gone down range. So there is a gap in there, and sometimes, depending on the quality of the powder, it's a longer gap than you would expect. But again, that gives you a chance to move and get off your target.
So this is fascinating. You were involved in the Parker's Revenge site.
So
and you're also involved with the Elmbrook site. Is the Elmbrook site, which was used, I think it was called Bloody Angle? Is that where it?
So in the 19th century, there were a lot of bloody angles after the Civil War. They were naming Bloody Angle in a lot of different places, and I think that's when that section of the battlefield where the road takes a turn to the north and then to the east by Hartwell Tavern became called that. Now it's called Elmbrook Hill, because it's right above Elmbrook. Now, I can say, because the Friends posted it, that there was an archaeology project there, and I can say that I was there for the entire time, and I can say that I'm studying the data right now, but I can't say what was found yet. The park, I think, will be releasing that this spring for the 250th. So yes, and I worked on Parker's also, and every other project that has been done on the battlefield, and private work just off the battlefield.
All along.
Yeah, and we're trying to compile all of that data. So what we'd like to do is take every musket ball found, and we use GIS to map in every find and number each ball. So we collect the data that's on the ball that we can learn something from, like the compression banding, or if it hit a tree, if it hit cloth, we can see cloth imprints in the balls. So we collect all that data with GIS, and then we're starting to map it all. So that soon we should be able to lay it out all along the whole battlefield, and you'll be able to see every musket ball and where it was found.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty impressive. Modern technology.
Hello? Where did one usually carry a powder horn?
So a powder horn or a cartridge box would be carried here. Or there were some left-handers who carried a powder horn over here, like James Hayward's horn is a left-handed horn. So he wore it on his left-hand side. But for military service, for the most part, everything is carried on your right hip. So when you would grab a cartridge, you'd grab it out of your cartridge box, load your gun, and then you were ready to fire, but it was on this side.
And when it went through, did it cause more of an explosion because he had the...
No, his horn was empty.
Oh.
And he had been firing all day, according to what is said in the 19th century. But there's no spark from the lead ball hitting the horn, so it wouldn't explode. It wouldn't blow up in his face. So if you're wearing the horn, the shot looks like it came from here, but it could have moved in front of him if he was getting a drink and come in through here. So we've had doctors look at it and see what internal organs would have gotten destroyed. It's pretty nasty, yeah. Yeah, because those horn shards, you saw them, they're sharp, along with the lead ball.
And how long did it take to reload? Like usually...
So a good soldier could load 4 times in a minute. So, but that's not under fire. So I'm sure that some of these guys were fumbling. We know from some of the archaeological digs that people are trying to load and they're dropping musket balls, and they have to grab another one and reload again. So, it could be anywhere between 2 and 4 per minute. And you got to remember, your enemy on the other side is doing the exact same thing. So it's not like one has a machine gun and one has a flintlock. Everybody's doing the same thing, trying to get their guns loaded.
Any other questions? One in the back?
How are the British guns different from the guns used by the colonists left over from the French and Indian War?
How were they different from the French and Indian War to the Revolution?
Or like, how are the colonist guns different from the
So,
guns
so
used by
most of the
British?
colonist guns are, like I mentioned, are hunting arms. So they have a smaller bore. The English arms have a specific bore size and ball that they fire, certain barrel lengths, whereas the provincial guns are all different sizes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Before
Let me just-
we give a final round of applause, please listen carefully. To all of the students, in a moment, you're going to all come up to the front and we're going to take a group picture. Then to this side, we have a request of you that without a paper in town now, we're finding it a little bit difficult to get information out, and the pace of what we're doing is beginning to pick up. So rather than scooting out real quickly, perhaps you would stop a moment and look at the tables, particularly the handout that shows all of the different events that are coming up. You'll be seeing these around town. There we are, right there. So subject to a little bit of revision as we add and things happen, but that is your cast of activities for the spring. Do you wish to
Just a couple other things. I just want to, again, thank the Acton Lions Club. We have a few of them here. They've been our largest financial supporter for the last year and a half. ActonTV, who is live streaming most of the time for us when they can, unless there's a school board committee meeting. And again, for all of our speakers that come, it's really great. We have really a lot of programming. And we have a subcommittee that Pam and Bob and folks are on that are in this room, and Ann, and they really work hard to get really good speakers that are true to the time and period. So thank you very much for all coming. And then, we have a store out there. If you haven't had a chance to get a coffee mug or something, feel free to visit that. There's a couple of items will be added to this as we go further in the spring. We're looking to recreate something along the lines of our October 1st event at the library, but I think it'll be across the street at the Congregational Church, probably Wednesday the 16th. And then if you didn't have a chance to try our Isaac Davis Brown Ale, it will be back out again on March 13th. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And so come on up, everybody. So thank you.